The jungle was quiet in a way that made men nervous, because silence in the Pacific usually meant someone was watching and waiting to kill you. The American sniper lay flat in the mud, sweat running into his eyes and soaking through his uniform, rifle steady against his shoulder, heart somehow calm despite the tension that made every muscle in his body want to scream. Japanese soldiers hidden somewhere in the thick green tangle of trees and vines were searching for any mistake, any sign of movement, any shadow that didn't belong. One small movement would mean death. One careless sound would bring a bullet. One shadow falling wrong would end everything. He needed them to fire first, needed to draw them out of hiding, needed them to make the mistake instead of him. So he reached into his pack and pulled out something strange, something he'd been working on for days. A fake head. It was carved from wood, roughly shaped like a human skull, painted with a skin tone that looked real enough from a distance, and topped with a helmet that had already been shot through once before in a different fight. Slowly, carefully, moving with the patience of a man who knew that rushing meant dying, he raised it above the edge of the earth berm, just enough to look real, just enough to tempt a trigger-happy enemy soldier who thought he'd found an easy American kill. He waited, controlling his breathing, watching the tree line through the corner of his vision. Then it happened. A crack split the humid air. Then another sharp report echoed through the jungle. Then many more, rapid fire, overlapping. The jungle exploded with rifle fire aimed at the dummy head, shots coming from multiple positions as Japanese soldiers competed for what they believed was a confirmed kill. 83 shots in just a few minutes. The trap had worked better than he'd dared to hope. Before we go any further, if stories like this get your heart racing and you love hearing about the most incredible moments of World War II, hit that subscribe button because WW2 Vault dives into the most unbelievable true combat stories every single week. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. What those Japanese soldiers didn't know, what they couldn't have known in their excitement and confidence, was that every single shot they fired gave away their exact position. And by the time the firing finally stopped and the jungle fell into an uncertain silence, the American sniper had mapped their entire defensive line in his mind like a deadly puzzle he was ready to solve. By sunset, when the light was fading and the jungle sounds were returning to normal, 4 to 7 enemy soldiers would be dead, all taken down methodically by one calm Marine who had turned patience into a weapon more powerful than any artillery barrage. The Pacific War was brutal in a way that few Americans back home could have imagined before their sons and brothers started landing on those remote islands scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Because the enemy didn't fight in open fields with clear lines and honorable rules of engagement. They hid in trees where you'd never think to look, in caves that went back into the hillsides for hundreds of feet, in tall grass that could conceal a dozen men just waiting for you to walk past. And sometimes they waited for days in the same position just to kill one man who made one mistake. Japanese soldiers were skilled marksmen, disciplined in ways that shocked American commanders, and deadly with rifles they'd been shooting since childhood. And many of them had grown up hunting in the mountains and forests of their homeland long before the war ever reached the Pacific. They believed they owned the jungle, believed it was their territory and their advantage, and for a long time in those early desperate months, they were absolutely right. American troops learned quickly, often through painful losses and terrifying close calls, that normal infantry tactics learned in training camps back in the States didn't always work in the thick, suffocating heat and green darkness of the Pacific Islands, because you rarely saw who was shooting at you until it was too late. A single hidden rifle positioned well could stop an entire unit cold, pinning men down for hours while fear slowly ate away at their nerves and the heat drained their strength. That's why snipers became so critically important in the Pacific theater. Because one good sniper who knew what he was doing could accomplish what 100 regular soldiers with all their equipment and training couldn't. He could hunt the hunters, turn the enemy's own tactics against them, and make them afraid of the jungle they thought belonged to them. The Marine behind the rifle that day wasn't famous, didn't have his name in newspapers back home, and he didn't see himself as a hero doing something extraordinary. Just a man with a job to do and other men around him who needed to stay alive long enough to see home again. He'd learned fast in the jungle during his first weeks of combat, learning how light moved through the canopy of leaves at different times of day, how shadows shifted and changed at dawn and dusk, how sounds carried differently in wet air versus dry, and most importantly, how the enemy thought and reacted under pressure. The Japanese soldiers in that sector liked to fire quickly once they spotted what they believed was a target, confident in their superior marksmanship and certain of the kill before confirming it. That confidence, that slight arrogance born from early victories, would cost them everything. The dummy head trick wasn't something new he'd invented, because snipers on both sides had used variations of it throughout military history, but it was incredibly risky in practice, because it meant trusting completely that the enemy would fire without hesitation and that their bullets would hit the dummy instead of finding you. He'd carved the head himself over several nights, using scraps of wood he'd found, painting it carefully by hand with whatever materials he could scavenge, even scuffing up the helmet so it looked worn and combat-used and real from a distance. Then he waited for exactly the right moment, when the heat was heaviest and made men tired and careless, when nerves were tight from hours of silence, and when he knew enemy snipers would be watching for any opportunity. Slowly, moving it just inches at a time, he raised the dummy into view above the berm. The first shot punched clean through the helmet with a sharp metallic ping that he heard even from his low position. He didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't do anything except watch and listen. The second shot cracked past, close enough that he heard the bullet cutting through the heavy air. Then the firing picked up fast, rifles snapping from multiple directions hidden in the jungle canopy as Japanese soldiers competed for credit for what they thought was an easy confirmed American kill. In those critical moments, while death flew inches above his head, the sniper didn't think about the danger or let fear creep into his mind. He watched with intense focus. He counted each shot carefully. He marked each muzzle flash in his memory, each sound and where it came from, each tiny movement in the brush that gave away a hidden position. When the shooting finally slowed down and then stopped completely as the enemy soldiers waited to see if the American would fall, he carefully lowered the dummy head back down and began his real work, the deadly mathematics of combat that he'd been preparing for. One by one, working with methodical precision, he adjusted his position slightly, shifted his rifle to a new angle, controlled his breathing to steady his aim, and waited with infinite patience for the smallest sign of life from the enemy positions he'd marked. A hand moving to reload. The edge of a helmet catching sunlight. A face pressed too close to a rifle sight for just a second. Each time he identified a target, he fired once, placing the shot exactly where it needed to go. Never twice at the same target, because a second shot would give away his position. The jungle echoed with sharp cracks that now meant death for the men who had fired first. Japanese soldiers tried desperately to move to better positions, tried to hide deeper in the vegetation, but panic had replaced the discipline they'd shown earlier, and panic makes even trained soldiers careless and predictable. Some broke cover and ran, hoping speed would save them. Some froze completely, afraid that any movement would draw the Americans' attention. Some fired wildly into the trees in random directions, hoping luck would guide their bullets to a target they couldn't see. None of it worked. The sniper stayed completely calm, his breathing slow and measured, his movements minimal and precise, letting the rifle do the work it was designed to do. Hours passed under the brutal sun. Sweat soaked his clothes until they clung to his skin. His shoulder ached from the rifle's steady recoil. His eyes burned from the strain of constant vigilance. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop, because stopping meant the enemy would regroup and the advantage would be lost. By late afternoon, when the light was starting to change and the heat was finally beginning to break, the count had reached numbers that sounded impossible to believe. 4 to 7 confirmed kills in one single day. Not in a wild infantry charge with hundreds of men. Not with bombs dropped from planes or artillery shells fired from miles away. Just one man, one rifle, 1,000 rounds of carefully aimed ammunition, and a simple trick that turned enemy confidence into a death sentence they'd written themselves. Nearby Marines who'd been pinned down for hours could hardly believe what they were hearing over the radio, but they didn't question the result because they could see it for themselves. The enemy fire that had been constant and deadly all morning had stopped completely. The pressure that had kept them trapped had lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. Men could move again, could advance, could breathe without waiting for a bullet. That single day changed how Japanese units in that entire sector approached American positions from then on, because suddenly every helmet visible above cover, every shadow that moved wrong, every head raised to look for targets could be bait for a trap. They became slower in their movements, more cautious in their aggression, more hesitant to take what looked like easy shots, and that hesitation, that new fear they carried, saved dozens of American lives in the days and weeks that followed. One sniper had shifted the tactical balance of an entire battlefield without ever being seen by the enemy, without ever exposing his position, without ever giving them a chance to fight back effectively. The impact of what he'd done went far beyond the raw numbers written in after-action reports, because stories like this spread incredibly fast among troops living in foxholes and fighting for their lives. And morale matters more in war than most people back home ever understood. Knowing that someone out there could outthink and outwait and outfight the enemy gave exhausted Marines something powerful and intangible but absolutely real. Hope. Confidence. The belief that they weren't helpless against an enemy that seemed to own the jungle. It reminded them in a visceral way that the jungle didn't belong to the enemy alone, that Americans could learn and adapt and win using the same patient, deadly tactics. The sniper never celebrated his achievement that day, never talked much about it in letters home or with other Marines later, because killing wasn't something to brag about or be proud of in that simple way. It was something you lived with, something that stayed in your mind long after the shooting stopped. He knew that every single shot he'd fired that day meant a life ended, a man who'd had his own story and his own reasons for fighting. But he also knew with absolute certainty that if he hadn't done what he did, if he'd hesitated or failed, those same 4 to 7 men would have kept killing his friends and brothers in arms for days or weeks to come. In the Pacific War, there was no clean moral choice that let you sleep easy, only survival and the hope that you could get yourself and your friends home alive. When the war finally ended and men started coming home to parades and celebrations, stories like his faded quickly into the background, replaced by coverage of big dramatic battles with famous names and generals moving colored pins on maps in newsreels. But on that hot, suffocating jungle day in the Pacific, history turned on patience, on wood shavings carved into a crude human shape, on paint mixed from whatever was available, and on the nerve to raise a fake head into enemy fire while trusting completely in your own skills and judgment. That's the truth about World War II combat that doesn't always make it into the history books, because it wasn't always about massive tank battles and 1,000-plane bombing raids and flags being planted on mountains. Sometimes it was just one man lying still in the mud, thinking harder and longer than the enemy, studying their patterns and psychology, and using their own confidence and training and aggression against them in ways they never saw coming. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault. If you want more true combat stories that show how the war was really fought by individual soldiers making impossible decisions, hit that subscribe button, because next time we're diving into another moment where one person's decision and courage changed everything for the men fighting beside them.